All right. So when we talk about the central nervous system, we talk about the brain and the spinal cord. Those are part of the central nervous system. And for some of you that have your labs this semester, you will know that you had also learned about some neurons, which we learned last week as well. Look at neurons, and we also look at neuroglial cells, and we look at some in the central nervous system, which means that those will be associated with the brain and spinal cord. And we also talked about the ones in the peripheral nervous system. All right, so we said the one in the central nervous system, there are neuroglial cells aside from the neurons. And we said neuroglial cells help to support the nourish the neurons. And we said that those neuroglial cells in the central nervous system are the oligodendrocytes. We said they are the ependymal cells, the microglia cells. I hope you still remember that. And we said microglia, oligodendrocytes, a Schwann cell, and the astrocyte. All right, so those are neuroglial cells that are associated with the neurons in the spinal cord and the brain. Now, the spinal cord is the portion that continues right below the brainstem. You see the spinal cord continue right below the brainstem where you have the foramen magnum right under below occipital bone. If you still remember from your bones, from the bones, when we looked at the bone, there is a large opening right below the occipital. And it's that opening that continues where the spinal cord continues from that foramen magnum, and it continues through cervical vertebra, continues through thoracic vertebra, and it ends at L1, right between L1 and L2. So it's like it gets to L1, right below L1, between L2. That's where the spinal cord stops. All right, so the spinal cord does not run through the entire length of the vertebral canal. I'll be showing you vertebral bone. I'll show you all of that. All right. Now, here is, let me open my annotations. All right, so the spinal cord, you see it in the vertebral canal, and the vertebral canal is what is the foramen. You see vertebral foramen that is between the vertebral bones. You remember every vertebral bone have vertebral foramen, all of them. Now, so that is what forms the vertebral canal. And you see it extend just above the foramen magnum, which is the foramen magnum you see on occipital bone on the inferior portion, and it goes between L1 and L2. So the spinal cord terminates at that point, right? And the point where it terminates, we call it conus medullaris. I will show you in a bit. Now, the major function of the spinal cord is that it helps to respond to stimulus. We call it the center of reflex. All right, and we'll be looking at what reflex are at the end of this chapter, and what is reflex arc and the component of the arc. Then once the spinal cord receives the stimulus comes there, then it's going to be integrated. It will be processed. You remember I talked about that last week when I look at the function of the nervous system generally. And it has tracts of upward and downward travels to the brain. So we call it ascending and descending tracts, taking information in and out of the brain. Remember, we talked about sensory input last week and motor output. Now, the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral bones because it's inside the cavity of the vertebra, which we call vertebral foramen, right? Like every other organ, or like every other organ that we've looked at, the spinal cord also have membranes that covers it. Now, the membranes that covers the spinal cord, we call it meninges. Now, you remember that when we're looking at some some visceral organs when we're looking at the heart, the lungs, when we're looking at chapter 1, when I talked about the cavities. I told you about serous membrane. And I told you serous membrane is serous membrane because it secretes serous fluid. All right. So serous membrane simply means membrane, but it is called serous membrane because it secretes fluid. Now, when you're looking at some joints, we have membrane that we also call synovial membrane. And the reason it's called synovial membrane, it's also because of its function, it secretes synovial fluid. All right. Now, the same thing, the meninges is simply the name that is associated to the membrane of the brain and spinal cord. So every membrane that you see around the brain and spinal cord is called meninges. Now, don't confuse it with neurons. Neurons are the cells in this organ. The organ is the large organ which has covering that covers it. It's just like when you're looking at the heart, we talked about pericardium, we talk about visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium, right? However, when you're looking at the cardiac cells, that's a different thing again, all right? Now, so last week we looked at neurons, and I told you about endoneuron, perineuron, and epineuron. Those are the membranes that covers connective tissues that covers, those are the membranes that covers the cells itself, the neuron, the nerve cells. However, looking at the spinal cord as it were, there's also a membrane that covers it, and I'm going to show you something later. But so the outer membrane that covers the spinal cord is called the dura mater. That's the outermost. The middle is arachnoid, and the inner one is the pia mater. Now, you will have heard of meningitis, either at the point when you are taking injection or when you are taking the vaccine, or when you you just say you want to take meningitis shots. Some of you had to take it in preparation for medical school, nursing school, all of that. Now that is simply from the word meninges. So when you say you want to take meningitis, you know that anything that ends with itis is most likely inflammation, except if it's somebody's name, right? Okay, so anything that ends with high T, high S is inflammation, most likely when you look at it. Now, so meningitis simply means inflammation of the membrane of the spinal cord or membrane of the brain. So that means you don't see meningitis any other part of the body because you only have meninges in those areas. All right. And meninges simply means membrane that covers those those organs or those structures. Now, so the meningitis could be due to infection, which is why we take the vaccine to prevent it. Now, when the membrane gets inflammation, it's simply that the membrane could get swollen, become tender, red, and painful. And that is what we call meningitis, inflammation of the meninges. All right, now let's go. I will talk about that and show you the layout in a little bit. Okay, so looking at this now, here is the orientation or the arrangement of the spinal cord. Now, you have the vertebral bone, which is the outermost structure. And if you look at this, you will know that here is the posterior side of the bone. Because if you are touching your back, you will notice you are touching the spinous process. You remember this is the spinous process when we look at this vertebral bone. Now, this is transverse process. This is transverse process for this bone. So this is the posterior portion of the bone, and the other side is the anterior side. Now, and you remember from last week that if this is the posterior portion, then right here will be the posterior median fissure. And we talked about how you have the anterior, on that side, you have the posterior here on of the posterior gray horn. We talked about how that you have posterior root of nerves here, and it is the posterior root that have the posterior or dorsal root ganglion, which is ganglion simply means cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So anytime you see cell bodies outside the central nervous system and they accumulate like this, we call them ganglion. So that's ganglion there, which means cell body outside the central nervous system. So You see, these are the posterior root of a nerve. Posterior root coming from this spinal area, another posterior root coming from here, and they merge to form what we call spinal nerve. All right. So you have this anterior root carrying motor information, posterior root carrying sensory information, and sensory information means information coming from the senses, meaning that information coming perceived by your senses, by perception, sense of touch, smell, pain, all of those senses carries information through the posterior root. And then it takes it from the sensory, think about it, from the sense organs, it's going to take it to the brain. So that means this posterior will be what we form the ascending tract, taking information to the brain. And the anterior takes motor information and takes it to the spinal cord. To the organs that should take action, either to gland or to muscles. All right. So you see the anterior root and the posterior root synapse here to form the spinal cord, the spinal nerve. All right. So here you see, here that's the spinal nerve there. Now the spinal nerve will now later split into ramus or rami, as the case may be. So we are not going to have anterior rami, posterior rami, and I'll tell you about rami later. Now, what I want to take note here is anterior root of nerve, posterior root of nerve gather together to form the spinal nerve itself. So when we say we have pair of spinal nerve, that there are two spinal nerve per each region, this is anterior root, posterior root form one spinal nerve, posterior root and anterior root form the second spinal nerve in this area. So this makes it a pair. All right, let's go. Now, so this is the vertebral bone, and right after the vertebral bone, you are going to have a space that is between the vertebral bone and the membrane, and we call that space epidural space. Now, this space is going to be somewhere here. Since this is vertebral bone, this space is going to be here. And so we call this space epidural space. Now, this epidural space, what you have there is fat. Now, you will take note for people that may have had bad experience, like as a baby, labor, or people who may have been close to people that had delivery. You will notice that when when a woman wants to go into labor, they want to look for a way to manage the pain, and they give them epidural injection. That epidural injection, they put it in the epidural space. Now, the epidural space is filled with fat, like I said. And if you take note, generally, where do they do injection? Normally, most of the time, most of your injection goes into the subcutaneous membrane or hypodermis. The reason we put injection in the hypodermis is because two things. The hypodermis is rich in fats, and number two, it is rich with blood vessels. So when you put injection there, because it's loose connective tissue, fat, the injection is going to spread out quickly. And also the fact that blood vessels are there is going to circulate through the body quickly. All right. So those are the two reasons you put the injections are administered into the hypodermis. All right. The same way, it's the reason epidural goes to the epidural space. Now, let me show you this slide before I come back here again. All right, now look at this. Here is what I call the epidural space, which is filled with fat. So you see, this is the vertebral bone, and here is the epidural space. And you can see the yellow fat there. You can see the fat there. That is the fat. Now, what does that actually even do? Aside from the fact that it can help with circulation, think about it. If you put these meninges now that we say that could be inflamed, that could be that inflammation could happen, it could be hot, which could be due to infection, trauma, or anything. Now, if you put these meninges, if this meninges, which is the dura mater here, if it is directly on the bone, then it won't be difficult to have trauma. If the meninges and the bone are directly in contact. That should not be. So the fat also helps to cushion the area to prevent trauma or traumatic experience, to prevent inflammation. All right. So I'll get back to that slide. Now, so when you look at this, you see the first thing you see after the epidural space is now the dura mater. And when you look at the dura mater, you see the dura mater is right here. This is this sheet. This is this connective tissue. That is the dura mater. After the dura mater, you are going to have subdura space. So think about it. Epi usually means outside. So epidural means outside the dura. So that means epidural is going to be between the dura, somewhere around here, epidura. All right, outside dura, outside the dura. Now, then you're going to have the dura, which is this guy here. This is the dura mater here. Then now, right after the dura mater, you have subdura. So that means subdura is this space here, right inside. Now think about it, epi, outside, sub, below, inside, right? So it's a minimal space that is filled with interstitial fluid and it's right there, all right? Now the next thing after the subdura will be the arachnoid, and here's the arachnoid. Now this is the arachnoid, and it's a membrane that is almost stick to the dura mater. All right, the boundary, the difference between the dura mater and the arachnoid is that between the arachnoid and the dura mater, there's subdural space. Right now, after the subarachnoid, there's going to be subarachnoid space. Now, this space is very important. That is where you have the CSF, which I talked about in the last video, cerebrospinal fluid. Now, I told you the cerebrospinal fluid helps to cushion, to give buoyancy to the brain, to the spinal cord of the brain. It's both in both areas. This orientation is the same for brain as well. Now, so after the subarachnoid space, then it's going to be the pia mater, which is the closest membrane to the spinal cord. And here is the spinal cord itself. All right, so you have the pia mater. Now, what is key about the pia mater? I will talk about this section when I'm looking at the whole of the spinal cord at large. But let me give an hint now. Now, see, I told you the spinal cord continues. It starts from the foramen magnum of the cervical of the occipital bone, and it continues down up to L1 and L2. So when the spinal cord terminates at that point, think about it. If the spinal cord just terminates in the middle of a whole canal, you know, the vertebral column continues from the cervical up to coccygeal, the coccyx. Now, if the spinal cord terminates right between L1 and L2, what's going to happen? There's going to be space for the spinal cord to be dangling, because there's going to be L3, L4, L5, L5, then there's S1, S2, there's sacrum, right? And then there's coccyx. Those space make the spinal cord to be dangling. So to prevent that, this pia mater, which is the closest membrane to the spinal cord, when the spinal cord ends as the conus medullaris, which I will still talk about, the pia mater does not end. The pia mater continues, and that continues till the point, the coccygeal area, and that the end of that pia mater is what we call phylum terminal. Think about it as a terminating point, phylum terminal. All right. So the pia mater is a membrane that adheres to the spinal cord. It extends inferiorly to the phylum terminal, which is where it anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. And I'll show you that. Now, the other thing that is very necessary that helps to also hold the spinal cord in position is that there are ligaments on the side of the spinal cord. So on this side here, there are ligaments that hold the spinal cord in position. I will show you in the next slide where I have the image. We call that ligament denticulate ligament. All right? It holds the spinal cord inside the vertebra. Now, let me tell you something that is funny about dura mater, the pia mater. I was telling my student yesterday about this. So, when I was younger, my I mean, I'm from Nigeria, and our parents are usually very conservative. Most parents. So when I was younger, they used to buy. Let's say when I was like 6, 7, they will buy me shirts that is about the size I am wearing now. That's the kind of shirt my parents would buy for me then, because they will tell you that if they buy you shirts that are smaller, you are going to outgrow it in a year. And so if they are like dress shirts that I expect you to wear to church, dress that I expect you to wear for outings, they don't buy you shirts of your size. They buy you shirts that are like 3 ages ahead of you. So now, when I wear those shirts, you have to fold the sleeves, because the sleeve is just like my hand is going to be here and my sleeve is going to be this long. So I have to fold the sleeves anytime I'm wearing the shirt, because the shirt is going to be quite big. So now think about it. If this is my shirt, all right, and my end is here, and then this is dangling, this is the pia mater. That is how the pia mater does. So the pia mater continues beyond the spinal cord. So think about that. Don't forget that analogy. That is the pia mater. All right. I think that is that. All right. Then after this, you are going to have the spinal cord right there. All right. Here is a view of what I just discussed. And if you look at this, you see the spinal cord start here around the foramen magnum, and you see the cervical continues that way. Now, don't mix it up. Cervical vertebra, there are 7 cervical vertebrae, right? C1 to C7. However, cervical nerves are 8, C1 to C8. There are 7 vertebral bones, but 8 cervical nerves. Don't confuse that. Now, so the spinal cord continues from there and goes down. You see that? Between L1 and L2, that's where it ends, in between L1 and L2. And the spinal cord itself terminates as conus medullaris. So we call it conus medullaris. Now, however, the pia mater continues, which is the closer innermost membrane. The pia mater continues, and you see that it continues all through to the point of the coccyx here. So we call that phylum terminal. All right, that's the spinal cord. Now, when you look at the spinal cord, there are some portion of the spinal cord that looks like a little enlarged than the other portions. And if you look at this, you can tell that this side is more enlarged. This is more enlarged, and this here is also more enlarged. You can see this side more enlarged as well. So we call the portion that are enlarged, we just call them enlargements, and we describe it by the location where the enlargement is. So here we have what we call cervical enlargement, and here we have what we call lumbar enlargement. Now, the enlargement is simply because some of the nerves aggregate, and when they aggregate, they form a plexus. We call it plexus. Plexus simply means network of nerves. You know how we say that cells aggregate together to form tissues? That cells that work together to perform a specific function, we call them tissues. The same way, nerves that work together to perform specific function, we call them plexus. All right? That's not a better way to explain it to you. It's just an aggregate, a accumulation or a cumulative gathering of nerves at that location. So we call it plexus. All right. So now this enlargement is because those nerves gather together to perform the function. And so we call it cervical and lumbar enlargement. All right. The nerves there for the cervical the nerves there supply the upper limbs, and the lumbar, the nerves there supplies the lower limb. Now, I told you already, conus medullaris is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. Phylum terminal is the point where is a thread-like extension of the pure matter where it helps to stabilize the spinal canal, the spinal cord in the canal by continuing the trip to the coccygeal. Then the one that we call cauda equina. Now, cauda equina is right here. You can see it here. That's cauda equina. And it is somewhere in this region. We say that is a dorsal and ventral root of lower spinal nerves. So some spinal nerves that are here also have dorsal and ventral. Think about the dorsal as anterior and posterior, right? Or posterior and anterior of the spinal nerve in that region. That's what we just call cauda equina. Now, spinal segment, it's area of the skull from which each pair of spinal nerves arise. All right, so this here we call it spinal segment, where the spinal nerves shoot out, spinal segment. All right, let's go. Very good. So now look at this image again. We, in quotes, have a little view of this last week, if I'm not mixing it with my lab now. Now, if you look at this again, this is the vertebral bone. This is the epidural space where it's filled with fat. The next thin line there is the epidural, is the dura. That's what you see there. You can see that there. Then between the dura and the arachnoid, you have subdural space. It's not labeled there here, but it's right in between the dura and the arachnoid, subdural space. Then right after the arachnoid, you have the subarachnoid space here, where I told you is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, which is very important. You can see that. So all of this space is here. All of this space here is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. You can see that all of over here. Then after that, you have the pia mater, which directly touch the spinal cord itself. Then you have the spinal cord in there. On the spinal cord, you have the gray area, which is the H area. That's a gray. Then the white area is what we call the white matter. The gray is gray because it has cell bodies. And we know cell bodies are filled up with nuclear body. And we call nuclear body is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. You remember that? And the color of the nuclear body is gray. That's why we call it gray matter. Then also, so there's nuclear body there, which is cell body, including all other organelles there. So we have mitochondria there, we have Golgi apparatus there, we have ribosome. All of those organelles are in the gray matter. We have dendrites as part of it, and also all other axons that are not myelinated. So we say unmyelinated axon. But in the white matter area, what we have there alone is the myelinated axon. And it's white because myelin is white. All right. So again, if you look at this, you have the nerves here. You have the anterior roots coming from here, anterior roots. You have the anterior roots here. This is the anterior root here. That's what I'm shading now. Then you have the posterior root here. And I told you the way to always take note of the posterior root is this dorsal root ganglion. All right, I don't think I ever told you why there's a ganglion here. Now think about it. If you remember, I told you last week, I told you about 3 types of neurons. I told you that we have the unipolar neuron, we have the bipolar neuron, and we have the multipolar neuron. Now, the neurons that makes up this posterior root is a bipolar neuron, which is like this. It's a bipolar neuron. So because it's bipolar neuron, here is a cell body, right? And that is why you have this projection right there too. So it's the dendrite. You see the dendrite forming the axon. So one side is going to be the dendrite, one side is going to be the axon, and here is going to be the soma. And that is why you have that ganglion there. Because I told you that soma, ganglion simply means soma outside of the central nervous system. So when there is any soma or cell body that is not inside the cell, inside the nervous system, we call it ganglion. All right. Now, you see right here, I'm going to remove these, all of these annotations so that you can see what I have here. I can point to this. Now look at this. Right here is that cartilage I told you about, denticulate cartilage. You see, that denticulate cartilage is what reinforces the spinal cord on the lateral side, and then the pia mater holds it inferiorly so that it's not moving around. And you know that on the superior side, the spinal cord is simply a continuation of the brain. All right. So here, these are the ramus. So you see this anterior root, posterior root forms the spinal cord. Then the spinal cord from there now split into ramus, okay, or rami. So you can see the rami here splitting after that from the spinal nerve, right? Spinal nerve, not spinal cord. All right, I think that's all on this image. We'll continue from here. Oh, sorry. Now, when you look at this review of what we did last week now, here is anterior median fissure. And anterior median fissure is going to be right here, right? And posterior median sulcus is going to be right here. Roots, they are bundles, roots, which we call anterior root, posterior root, right? They are bundles of axon that enter or exit the spinal cord. Bundle of axon. So here will be the axon of this bipolar neuron, and the dendrite is going to be here. So you think about it, the dendrite bringing information in process here, then sent to the spinal cord through the axon. All right. So the axon, the bundle of axon that enter or exit the spinal cord is what we call roots. So when you say anterior root, posterior root is the axon. Then they form what we call the spinal cord nerves here. All right. So the posterior root carries sensory information. We say that into the spinal cord. Then posterior root ganglion contains cell body of the sensory neuron. Then anterior root, motor axon that exits the spinal cord. So anterior root take information out of the spinal cord. Posterior roots bring information into the spinal cord. Let's go. Now, gray matter. I've told you about gray matter before. I'll just do a quick review on it again. Now, I told you already that gray matter simply is the H area here. This H area here is the gray matter. And you have the posterior horn, which we call the posterior gray horn. Posterior gray horn is where the sensory information enter the spinal cord. So when this posterior root bring information, this information comes in here. You see that through the posterior horn. All right, gray horn. So information gets it. Now I told you the posterior gray horn touch the root of the spinal cord here, but the anterior does not. So that means sensory information comes in through here. Now anterior gray horn is where motor neuron, you see that, are located. And so that means motor fiber will exit the spinal cord through the anterior. So this area, that is where you have anterior gray horn, and that is where the motor information is going to leave the spinal cord through the anterior gray horn. Now, lateral gray horn is this area here. And what happens here is that integration will happen here. And what kind of neurons does integration? It's interneurons. All right. Now, then you have the gray commissure. The gray commissure is this area where the spinal cord, where the spinal hemisphere, the both and right and left side connect. So this point here is the gray commissure. Now, and then inside at the middle of the gray commissure, we have this hole here, and we call that hole central canal. All right. And the central canal, what is key about it is that it contains cerebrospinal fluid. All right. Now, here is white matter. The white matter again surrounds the gray matter, and it is white because it is filled with myelinated axon. Those are the part that makes it up. If it's filled with myelinated axon, that tells us that it is the major job of the white matter is to transmit information because it is predominantly axon. So it will help to conduct information out of the spinal cord, right? It will help to conduct information either into the spinal cord or out of the spinal cord. Now, so when you look at the white matters, they are divided into columns. So we have the lateral column here, lateral white column. We have the posterior white column. We have the anterior white column. All right. Now, what do we mean by column? We already said that the white matter are made up of axon. So if it's made up of axon, then what we call column will be pathway. And so we call it tracts. All right. So tracts. Now, what makes up tracts? Tracts are made up of nerves fiber. So if I want to explain this now, I will say nerve fiber form tracts, tracts form columns. All right. Now, so tracts are bundle of nerve fiber that have common origin or destination and carry similar information. Now, we have the portion that we call ascending tract. And what ascending tract does is to take information from the spinal cord to the brain. So when information gets to the spinal cord to the brain, the portion that takes it to the brain, when information gets to the spinal cord, the portion that takes it to the brain is what we call ascending tract, and the portion that takes it from the brain to the spinal cord, descending tract. Now, the way I just think about it is ascending tract takes up, ascend, it's ascending because it's taking information from the spinal cord up to the brain. Then descending is bringing information from the brain to the spinal cord, so it's descending. I'll be a little fast now. Now, this is just showing you the image of the spinal cord, like we discussed. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, rather. And like I told you, there are 7 cervical, but there are 8. There are 7 cervical bones, cervical vertebra, but there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. So you don't want to confuse that. That's the only thing that is different. And here, so you have, here you know that you have, so we know we have 8 here. We know thoracic is usually 12, thoracic. So it's still 12. Lumbar is 5, it's still 5. Now, you remember when we're dealing with bones, when we look at ACL skeleton, I told you that sacrum, even though it is 1, but it's made up of 4 to 5 bones. Coccyx, even though it is 1, it's made up of 3 to 4 bones. So just link that to know that sacrum has 5 sacral nerves. Coccygeal only have 1 sacral nerve. All right, so that makes us 31 pairs. All right. If you look at this, you have, this is going to be a review of what we looked at last week, so I'm just going to run through it. Now, you remember we have spinal nerves, and we discussed it last week that spinal nerves are bounded by endomyneuron, perineuron, and endoneuron. So you can go back and look at that chapter 11 if you need to review anything there. All right, so I've told you that meninges, anterior and posterior root that originate from the spinal cord from the vertebral area form the spinal nerve. That means each spinal nerve have 2 roots, the anterior root and the posterior root. Then the root form the spinal nerve. Now, then the spinal nerve is going to split now into what we call ramus. And I told you that the posterior root of the spinal nerve carries sensory information. And when it carries sensory information, it's going to take the sensory information into the spinal nerve. Then we know that the anterior carries motor information and is taking it outside of the spinal nerves, right? Now, so I told you that but when they form the spinal nerve, and now you have the ramus. Ramus does not carry specialized information. They carry both information. Now you will see that here. So ramus carry mixed information. Now this is ventral ramus, which means anterior ramus, and you can see this information now is the motor information going to the skeletal muscles. All right. This information is sensory information going to the smooth muscles. They are all going to be carried by the ramus. The same thing here. You see this going to smooth muscles. You see this going to skeletal muscles. Those are what you see in ramus. They don't carry specialized information. They carry mixed information. So you have the dorsal ramus or posterior ramus, which is part that supplies the skin and muscles of the back. You have the ventral, which supplies the extremities and anterior wall of the trunk. You have the meninges, supplying the meninges, right? And the vertebra. Then you have the autonomic, which supplies the internal organs that does autonomic or automatic actions. Don't forget from chapter 11. All right, so this is the now I will start to talk about plexus now. And please take note of this. I told you earlier that plexus simply means aggregate of nerves that act together to perform specific functions. Now, the reason we call them plexus is because let's go. So plexus simply means network of nerves that work together to perform a function, right? Now, what forms the plexus? Roots does not form plexus. It is ramus that form plexus. All right. Now, which ramus form the plexus, or which rami? Because we are going to have anterior, ventral, meningeal ramus. Now, what forms the plexus is simply the anterior ramus alone. So anterior ramus of C1, anterior ramus of C2, it will combine like that and form a plexus. All right. Now we said that plexus are networks of nerves that are carrying the same information and going in the same direction. All right. So anterior rami branches of spinal nerve form a network by joining together with another anterior rami to form what we call plexus. You find them in the neck, in the arm, lower back, and sacral region. Now, let's go ahead. Now, looking at this, you have the cervical plexus. And when we say cervical plexus, we already talked about it, that plexuses are not formed by posterior ramus, or they are not formed by roots. They are simply formed by anterior ramus or anterior rami alone. So when you say cervical plexus, it is in the cervical area. If it's in the cervical area, then that means it's going to serve the cervical region. It's going to serve the head area. It's going to serve the neck, and it's going to serve the shoulder. Now, so when you see the C1 to C5, the ramus, anterior ramus of C1 to C5 forms the cervical plexus, right? Now, so that means if there's any damage to any area around that area, it will affect some of the innervations to that area. Now, for instance, now phrenic nerve serve the diaphragm. I know diaphragm contraction and relaxation is what leads to respiration and inspiration and exhalation, right? Respiration. So if anything happens that affect the phrenic nerve, and you can see the phrenic nerve here, all right? So you see the phrenic nerve is here, that's the phrenic nerve here, and you see the nerves that articulate, the anterior rami that articulates to form the phrenic nerve. Now, so if anything happen and damage anything above C3, it will affect respiration. Now, here is the brachial plexus. Here is brachial plexus, and brachial plexus is formed from anterior ramus of C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. Those are the ramus, anterior ramus, that form the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus serve the nerve, the skin and muscles of the neck, shoulder, and the upper extremities. Any damage to those areas will affect the innervation of those areas as well. Now, there's no plexus that we call thoracic plexus, right? So no plexus is formed by anterior ventral rami of the thoracic spinal nerves. They become intercostal nerves. And you know that intercostal nerves, those are nerves that supply the intercostal muscles, all right, that are responsible for respiration. Then we have the lumbar plexus, which is formed by the anterior rami of L1, L2, L3, L4, and those supply the abdominal wall, external genitals, and medial thigh. If there's any injury to femoral nerve, which you can see here, this is femoral nerve and obturator nerve, it will affect the ability to move the leg, and it will also lead to loss of sensation there. The last plexus is the sacral plexus, which is formed by L4 to S4. So L4, L5, S1, S2, S3, S4 form the sacral plexus, and that is what supply the butt and the lower extremities. If there's any injury to the sciatic nerve here, the sciatic nerve is a major nerve. You can see is the largest nerve actually. Any damage to it affects that region as well. So the last thing I'll talk about is the reflex arc.